Hey guys, today we're talking about Alarums and Excursions with Van Middlar, or Professor Van Middlar. And as always, I'm going to ask the first question, which is, what do you think are the three main concepts of your book, Professor?
Well, thank you, Madame. Thank you for the invitation to be guest of your book club. Well, one key theme is event politics. That's my way of expressing the capacity of any political order, but in my case, especially Europe, the European Union, to deal with shocks, to deal with unexpected events. And one of my main theses is that this requires a different set of political qualities, political talents than the counter concept of rules politics. Anyway, the EU, which is well known for its Brussels machine factory, its legislative genius and all that, has grown as a rule-making body. It really excels in rules politics. But my book, Alarums and Excursions, Improvising Politics on the European Stage, is about how the EU had to deal with big shocks. The Euro crisis, migration crisis 2015-16, which Italy remembers as well, Brexit, Trump, etc. And so these are two central concepts. Now, a third one is just linked is improvisation. It even features in the book's subtitle, and it is, well, a specific talent in a way of politicians who are faced with unexpected events. They have to act in the moment and they have to improvise. And there I say, well, of course, improvisation has also a bad ring to it. It's seen as a mistake. If you have to improvise, it can be a sign that you haven't done your homework or whatsoever. But there are also situations in life, and like in the theater as well, where the person, the guy who best improvises a jazz tune or on stage and speaking is the hero of the night. And therefore, improvisation should also be applauded. And it's a kind of talent you also need alongside, let's say, the more traditional rule political talents of a sense of proportion and being reliable and all those things. So I'll start with this.
Well, taking inspiration from your last chapter, well, I'm not sure if I can call that chapter, The Opposition Takes Stage. I was just wondering, because we talked with Professor Hicks, who's another author on European studies, etc. And with him, he said that the way to, I know you don't think that Europe's ever going to become a federation, but he said the way to get further integration would be through e-voting for the European Parliament. And I was just wondering, what was your take on further integration in Europe?
Well, I think Simon Hicks is right that participation in democratic life is obviously a key condition for Europe to become more democratic. Indeed, I do not think that the EU one day will be a federation like the US, like the USA, like the United States of America. But still, clearly, there's movement possible in the sphere of civic participation. My chapter, which you are referring to, the opposition takes the stage, is really about breaking with a kind of consensus way of functioning of EU politics. It's traditionally is rather technocratic. The rules that were made from the 50s, 60s, they were supposed to be the best rules and sound and reliable and scientific and technocratic, etc. And this had the effect, well, on the positive side, that most people tended to agree, but on the negative side, in the long run, that anybody who did not agree was in a way cornered as being either stupid because he or she hadn't understood, or quite simply bad because he was not a good European. And my thesis here, and well, I'm not the only one saying this, but I try to put it a little bit more systematically, is as long as the EU does not allow this kind of classic opposition, of counter voices, of other proposals, and considers them to be justified, legitimate, you get things like Brexit, where people feel, well, my voice is not heard here, I better walk out. So you need to have a stage, again, this metaphor of the theater, where you have various voices. And I think that is much more fundamental to give people the sense that the outcome of the political process is not done by Brussels steamrolling dissent opinion, be it national or ideological, but by really creating this open stage for conflict. And I think that's more important than, let's say, procedural or technical devices which come into play to increase voter turnout.
In fact, I think you talk about ideological opposition, and I'm not sure if it was political opposition or a real opposition. And I was just wondering if you could talk, this is my last question after Luca's going to ask you some questions. I was just wondering if you could talk a bit more about your chapter negotiating the Ukraine crisis, I think it was. And I was just wondering if you could just expand on it a little bit.
Well, that's a very open question, Madame, but it is one of the 4 big crises I described, indeed, and I didn't mention it earlier. It is when civil war erupted in Ukraine, war between Russia and Ukraine, when Russia seized Crimea. All this was back in 2014, and it was a big, massive crisis. Maybe, 7 years later, it looks somewhat normal. But back then it was really perceived as, leaving aside the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s, really the first time the European state order had been challenged by just ordinary land grabbing, 19th century style, by Russia. So, and this required really a firm response by the European Union, by European states. But what they discover in the process, and that's what interests me, is that with Russia as a rival, it was not possible to just say, well, this is international law. We have integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, and you have to uphold it, and that's the end of the story. You have to engage in a way in politics, in geopolitics, you could say, where you cannot be sure in advance of the outcome, and where also you may have to sacrifice some of the things which are dearest to you. You can be confronted with cruel dilemmas where you have to choose between, on the one hand, upholding the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, principles of international law, which of course you want as European nations, and on the other hand, with avoiding that the conflict would run completely out of hand, and that not just thousands or tens of thousands, but even more people would die in eastern Ukraine in particular as a result of the conflict. So a dilemma between, to put it starkly, justice and peace, two of Europe's highest values, and where simply Europeans realized we cannot have them both. We have to choose, we have to negotiate. And this is what then happened in practice. Chancellor Merkel and French President at the time, François Hollande, negotiated a ceasefire with Russian President Putin and his Ukrainian counterpart Poroshenko. And I give the details of the negotiation, but in essence, it boiled down to the difficulty of really, you could say, acting out of character for the EU to do geopolitics, to not be only on the moral high ground of values and principles, but to realize and to assume those kind of dilemmas. And that's what I thought was interesting. And in a way, looking a bit forward, as I said, this was 2014, but it gave a taste of things that were to come later, with Turkey, EU-Turkey migration deal the year after, and you could say even today in the relationship with China, where European states are also faced more and more with dilemma to which they are not at all used, one could say. They don't have the traditions, the tools, the mental habits to deal with these kind of dilemmas and problems.
It's Mike's all yours, Luca. Oh, geez. I think you got disconnected. Well, I'm prepared. I've got a whole list of questions. Well, actually, before asking one of the questions on the list, I was pretty shocked that you were, because like most of us, most of my friends who've studied strategic studies, etc., we were for the Javelin option and giving Ukraine anti-tank missiles to inflict more harm on Russia. But it seems like you're totally against that option. Could you explain that a bit more?
No, that's why you were. Can you put it on your mic?
Oh, sorry.
That's why you were intrigued by the chapter 4. Can you move? That's why you were intrigued by chapter 4. I was saying, well, or by this negotiation Russia chapter. Well, yeah, indeed. I did not agree with the US line and the US take in that conflict of almost all US politicians, Republicans, and most Democrats in the Obama administration who favored arming Ukraine. But there were very real risks to that approach, which were outlined in particular by Chancellor Merkel to President Obama, who tended to agree and who was a bit more risk averse. And the risk, in essence, was that for the Europeans, it would end in a proxy war in Ukraine between the US and Russia on the European continent. Because it meant that as the weapons the Ukrainians asked for, they could not man themselves. So they needed US military staff to help them. So you would get really, as I said, a war by proxy. And it was not clear where that would end. The more so since, as Chancellor Merkel pointed out, against her critics, that there was really no end game there. And she felt that Russia was prepared to, let's say, suffer much more, or to inflict pain on its own people, on its own soldiers, to win, or at least not to lose. Whereas in the West, there was not that political will to end up in a really costly, politically, militarily, perhaps even in terms of death toll, fight. So she went for the long game, and out of that conviction that sometimes it is better to minimize losses rather than to eradicate evil, as sometimes the temptation can be in the United States and also in the US narrative of any geopolitical conflict. It's almost systematically you end up in good against evil, and that is not indeed my take on those geostrategic conflicts and challenges. Luca, do you want to have another go at me?
Yeah. Can you guys hear me well? Yeah, okay. Well, let's talk with macroeconomics. So we've seen that even for countries like the Netherlands and Sweden, which have been always very competitive in terms of economic output, we've seen that their GDP per capita have stagnated in the past 10 years. They're lower than they were before 2008. How do you justify, and this is a new-wide phenomenon, at least for Western nations, how do you justify the EU's loss of productivity, especially compared to the United States? Is this bureaucratic juggernaut holding the EU behind?
Well, I think I would not seek the prime explanation in terms of the Brussels machinery. In a way, the fact that thanks to the EU, there is at least a continental market for 27 member states. Is a very big contribution to productivity, and it's a pity that the UK is no longer with the 27 in that respect. So without the EU as an organization, the output gap, or the productivity gap, sorry, with the US would be much worse. I think explanations would probably more in the well, or at least not merely in the institutional sphere, although part of it is also there if you look at differences between various member states, but also in the cultural sphere in terms of risk taking, venture capital, those kind of things. It's interesting, by the way, that you pick two, well, let's say northern countries, the Netherlands and Sweden, who have the main difference macroeconomically, that Sweden has kept its own currency, the Swedish crown, whereas the Dutch obviously have entered the euro from the beginning in 1999. And so you see that is not, in a way, decisive factor either, being inside or outside the eurozone for this kind of output figures.
Yeah, but you mentioned that, of course, the single market is, of course, a boost to the economy, at least on a nominal perspective. But you know, a single market works when everyone speaks the same language, when you have the same regulation everywhere, and when you have at least free movement of people. We see that in Europe we have 0.2%, I think, of the population that moved last year, compared to 2% in the United States. So do you think really the EU is providing what it promised, what the promise of Europe, of a united Europe?
Well, that's a good question. I think you're pointing to, or at least you give a bit more flesh to what I just called cultural factors. Huh? The fact of not speaking one language, the habit of almost all Europeans, or half of them, not to end up their lives more than 40, 50 kilometers from the place where they were born. And that has not so much to do with what the EU can do. These are much more, underlying habits and constraints. And so it really depends on what you promise, or what the promises you believe in, whether you are disappointed or not. And maybe I tend to have less high expectations. So I think it is sad and worrying, let's be clear about it, that EU, European continent, let's say, which 20 years ago was still an industrial competitor on a much more convincing scale with the US and China than it is today. Luca, you as a macroeconomist, you have no doubt seen a recent issue of The Economist on how the EU is outpaced by the US and China. But if you read through the lines, you could see that in a way, yes, the big difference is China. And while the US has kept up with China, it's in particular Europe which is losing out compared between 2020 and let's say 2000. So that's worrying. And I think EU action will need to be taken to both at member state level, but also in Brussels, to have a more strategic industrial policy, and to go from simple words like strategic autonomy, which is one of the buzzwords in the past year, of looking afresh at industrial and economic policies, to put some of those ideas into action.
I've got a very quick question. We've been asking most of our EU scholars to answer this question, which would be, how could Italy become more influential in the European stage?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. In a way, Italy has always been less influential than perhaps one would expect in view of its size and its demography. But this has been the case from the early days, almost. It was a Franco-German operation, and once the UK joined, people spoke of the big three. And briefly, when the UK left, I remember, I think at the time Renzi was still prime minister in Italy. He was hoping to that Italy would become member of the new big three, as it were. He had a reception of Hollande and Merkel at some Italian marine ship, if I remember correctly, where it was all carefully staged to create that impression. To answer your question, I think that would begin with a stronger economic performance, and perhaps also with governments that are in power longer. Well, if you look at Chancellor Merkel, of course, it's kind of extreme example, but when she leaves office, probably later this year or early 2022, if it takes very long for a new German government to form, she will have been in power for 16 years. And she will have seen like, well, probably 3 or 4, well, no, at least 4 French presidents. And I would not be able to say how many Italian prime ministers. And so this kind of political staying power, that's the word, that counts also in a political body like the European Council of EU Leaders, which is one of the most important bodies within the EU, and where your personal authority based on electoral victories is very important. So perhaps to conclude, Mario Draghi is much admired by his peers, but in a way, his peers, I mean the other presidents and prime ministers in the EU, but in a way he's still admired as the former central banker, which he was, for his technical expertise, for his personal charisma, the way he could play with the markets. But they all also know that he's not a man who has won an election. And the European Council is really a kind of club of alpha males and females who all have a very close relationship with their voters, their electorate, public opinion. And that's why they respect each other. And for instance, Renzi, I remember I still worked there when he came to power in 2013. It was after a kind of palace coup in the Italian left-wing family, when he stabbed Enrico Letta in the back, and they didn't really like that, his EU colleagues, because it was not a proper election victory. But 1 year later, he did win for his party, for the Democratic Party, the European elections. He was much more respected after that. And for Draghi, therefore, he would, in a way, he would have to win an election to transform his technocratic authority, which he clearly has at the table of EU leaders, into an even stronger political authority.
Can I ask 2 very quick questions before, because you said it was your last question, etc. So one question would be, how come you seem to give so much importance to the relationship the European leaders have in, like, from what you said, it seems like the relationship they have with other leaders is one of the most important things. I was just wondering if you could expand on that. And then my next question is on Varoufakis and your first chapter in the book.
Well, I think it's important to not underestimate the human factor in thinking about politics and about history. The prose I try to write is a mixture of, it's contemporary history in a way, and some of the chapters are mere chronicles of events, but loaded with a little bit of theory. And as an historian, I was trained as a historian, it always strikes me, of course, you have kinds of long-term trends and macroeconomic dimension and geopolitical factors, but there is also mere chance, stuff that happens, events, and then the interplay between those, let's say, short-term and long-term things and political personalities. And the result of that can be unpredictable, and yeah, one of the most fascinating ones for storytellers in a way is obviously persons, with their funny things, their characters, their tricks and things. And I also underline that because it's an institution, the European Council, which I know well, and historically it had been a little bit underestimated in the studies of the EU, with a lot of focus on the European Commission. So that's why I bring this factor of authority also, which I just mentioned.
Could you give me an example of when personality was really important in your experience?
Well, I can give a brief example. When French President Nicolas Sarkozy was around the table, I've seen 2 years of him. He was very forceful, energetic, and he was trained as a lawyer in the French tradition. So he could really make a case. So he could single-handedly, with one intervention, he could change the mood in the room of 26, 27 other leaders. And he did so at certain moments, both the Euro crisis, pleading for intervention in certain case of the European Central Bank, for instance, but also in the end, not so fortunate expedition, let's say, against Libya, against Gaddafi back in 2011, where Sarkozy and David Cameron teamed up together. Now to your final question.
My final question was about Varoufakis' solution to the Euro crisis. So I recently, actually, we had a very small private event with him. Well, unfortunately, Luca wasn't there, but it was about his book, Adults in the Room, I think. And he said that there was this, well, I'm not sure, it sounded really fanciful to me, but it was practically this solution that would let Greece deconstruct its debt, something like that. I was just wondering what your take was on that.
Well, I've also read his book, Adults in the Room, was very well written. It was a gripping read, definitely. But what struck me, so I'm unlike Luca and others, I'm not a macroeconomist by training. I'm not an economist. But what struck me that he did not convince other actors of his plan. He did not even convince his own prime minister, a party member, Alexis Tsipras, to follow suit on this plan. So even if economically maybe it was very brilliant and right, politically it was dead upon arrival, because politically and in politics it's about convincing other people of your ideas. He didn't do the job, and when his plan failed, he even left politics soon thereafter. And I know that since then he's been giving a lot of lectures and talks, etc. But so that's why I'm not so impressed by that proposal, because he was unable to sell it politically.
Very last question, very quick. How does one become president of the council? Like,
well, you have to be a. Well, I mean, this nomination, it's president of the European Council. You're chosen by the other EU leaders. So usually it's best to be a member of the club, so they know you. And then that's usually part of a whole package, and a lot of balances of geography, party politics, gender, small states, big states, etc. And at the end, you end up with the Belgian Prime Minister holding the gavel of the European Council. Luca, do you have a final question? Or
no, thank you much. I don't want to steal more of your time.
can I ask one final question?
No. You have run out of final questions.
All right.
Final question. No, I just want to thank you very much for coming today. Thank you all, and yeah, hope to see you again.
Yeah, good luck with your book club.
Thank you so
Thanks
much.
for diving into this. It was a pleasure to exchange. Very well prepared. And so keep up the good work.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much. Have a wonderful evening.
Bye bye.